Organisational arrangements really sets out to define how the organisation is set up to achieve its objectives. So we want to look at designing our different organisational structures, or in some parts of the world they call that the establishment, that support asset management objectives. We need to be clear around the defining of roles, responsibilities, and reporting lines clearly, and therefore we may consider, or we should consider, a RACI, so responsible, accountable, supported, consulted, informed, etc. We want to ensure, not just assure, but ensure that communication flows well between the various functions of the organisation, not just a speak and hope that people hear what's going on, but there is almost a feedback loop to confirm that people have heard and understand. We need to recognise how different contexts impact our organisational arrangements. That could be the industry, highly compliant, maybe not so compliant, geographically diverse, the type of product or service that you provide to stakeholders. And then, of course, linking structure and roles back to competency, culture, and decision making. In any organisation, there's a real risk that people lose sight of their actual responsibilities and sometimes accountabilities. The role clarity is important, but it's also important to acknowledge that the more senior you are in an organisation, the more descriptive it is in relation to outcomes. Whereas when you're starting off or more of a frontline operations, it's more prescriptive, defining what are the activities you need to do to contribute to an outcome. But the risk is, of course, unclear about those responsibilities, leading to, we talk about overlaps and gaps, but also discretionary decision making because you're unclear. The RACI chart, again, bringing that back, responsible, accountable, consulted and informed, but also to putting more effort and clarity into job descriptions to define those accountabilities, not just responsibilities. Now, working in silos may be seen as a bad thing. Actually, in a high-performing organisation, it can work very well. But we do run a risk if the functions are operating separately, they are doing their own thing and it's not aligned in terms of those overarching asset management objectives. We can reduce effectiveness, which therefore impacts efficiency and also is a symptom of poor alignment. So, coming back to the whole premise of the coordinated activity of an organisation, we need to really look at the creation of those cross-functional teams, promoting collaboration, not just consensus, and therefore the handoffs between the different functions across the life cycle becomes a value-added exercise, not just seen as a cost and disruption. You know, we've all been in organisations where we feel, here we go, we're going through another restructure. But at the end of the day, structures need to be fit for purpose to deliver value to our stakeholders, but also to fit for purpose in the way we all work together to support the asset lifecycle and service delivery. So the real risk is getting stuck with those traditional hierarchies that may not suit and be adequate for modern asset management needs. Flattening out an organisation can lead to greater agility, but if we do it without understanding the maturity of the organisation, agile can become fragile. So we need to look at reviewing and adapting structures to meet that maturity and also some of the strategic priorities, because we can't just think about the strategy without operations, and we can't just focus on operations without the strategy. The organisation will stay where it is, or worse, go backwards. When we think of communication in any organisation, there is communication down from the top of the organisation right down through to operations. But on a different axis, we've got communication across the life cycle. The real risk here is poor communication between the different levels or functions of the business can cause delays, mistakes, ambiguity, confusion, and sometimes tension. But to get around that, quite obviously, is to establish regular forums, different reporting mechanisms, and feedback loops. And those reporting mechanisms can be subtle in a leadership sense to make sure that, one, people are getting the message, but also understanding the message, which is really obviously important. Many of us, or if not all of us, would have experienced the fear or the resistance to change when it comes to a restructure. Will my job be safe? Will I be asked to do more? Will I be asked to do less? what's going to happen with the adjacent processes supporting my role and vice versa. So the real risk here is, of course, loss of status, maybe loss of influence, job security, reduced hours, more hours, but of course, new structures, reporting into someone new. So ideally, we need to engage early, engage often, have the conversation, explain why, putting out the rationale, but also to supporting the transition into the new structure, not just leaving it up to the individual. It's one thing to consider the organisational arrangements by way of organisational structure. And on a blueprint perspective, it can all stack up and make complete sense. But if you are designing an organisational structure without being mindful of the cultural or competence, you may find yourself setting back that organisation. There's an old saying, an organisation that is centred around talent will often fail. Those that are actually modelled around capability and we actually develop the capability and skills into those roles is likely to succeed. So the risk here is, of course, the structure doesn't support the desired culture or the workforce capabilities, output, etc. So the remedy, of course, aligning those organisational arrangements with training, culture building, performance system, but bringing people along on the journey and co-designing what does good look like. So from an ISO 55001 alignment, Section 5.3, roles, responsibilities and authorities obviously makes sense. It's an obvious one in terms of organisational structure, organisational arrangements. But we also, another strong alignment is back with Section 7.1, resources, because whilst we might be looking at the capabilities of our organisation by way of org structure, we may find that there is inadequate resources or capability at this time, or maybe ever, and therefore we need to consider going out to market, or 7.1 resources starts to come to fruition. So in summary, organisational arrangements make sure that people know their role in asset management and how they can contribute to the organisational goals. It's an easy statement to read like that, but as you've seen through some of these risks and challenges that we need to be aware of, it isn't impossible, but learnings for me have been bring people along on the journey, because if they understand why the organisation is being structured the way it is, buy-in comes earlier and there is less resistance to the changes ahead.